fear among the population, and by creating this fear, it also created the possibilities of the arming of people in order to protect themselves against slave violence. And I think you've indicated at least 3 insurrections, Alana, dealing with Harper's Ferry, John Brown, with Nat Turner, and Stono Rebellion, and et cetera. Now let's move on beyond the South, beyond the Civil War, and talk about some of the other things that helped to create that kind of violence in the South after the institution of slavery came to an end.
Now, when you think about violence in the South after slavery, you usually think about Martin Luther King's assassination at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. And Malcolm, most people don't think of this, but I think of this sometimes when I hear about it. Malcolm X's father and how he was in a car crash with a Ku Klux Klan member and he was severed in half. Mm. Now they think that crar crash was actually on purpose, that the Ku Klux Klan targeted his family because they used to burn crosses in his yard, and when his mother was so distraught over Malcolm's father's death that she actually had to admit herself into a mentally insane ward, and so he was on his own. So he moved down to New York City, where when Martin Luther King was later going around the world talking to people, that's when they met and they bonded a bit. But basically, their stories are 2 different stories. Now, when you go to Martin Luther King, you think how he had peaceful protests. He did everything the way the Lord wanted him to do it. He did it calmly, no gun violence. Now Malcolm X, he was the exact opposite. He did things with violence. He yelled. He fought for what he wanted. Now Martin Luther King was so much more calm. And when you think about them, some people don't notice it right away, but they were doing the same things, but in different ways. That's how John Brown and Nat Turner were. They were doing the same. Now they were doing the same thing, but for a little bit of different reasons. So basically, when you think about them, that's what you think about, their similarities.
And then the gun violence is present throughout this. Now, one of the more famous incidents I think you've mentioned to me earlier had to do with the Emmett Till. How did Emmett Till fit into all of this gun violence and this violence that was in the South?
Well, Emmett Till was a young boy when he was kidnapped from his Mississippi home, where the Ku Klux Klan pistol whipped him, gouged out his eyes, completely did so much to him, all because he allegedly flirted to a white woman when she asked him to. So if he didn't do it, you could only imagine what would happen if he didn't do it. But when he does something that a white lady asked for, he gets murdered. What would happen if he didn't do what she asked for?
And so Emmett Till, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, all of this violence that persisted during the institution of slavery, all pointed to the fact that many people in the South felt that there was a need for weapons and a need for guns, and not only against slaves, but against other whites who might also be willing to overthrow slavery. And I think you mentioned 2 of them. Tell me about something about John Brown. I think you mentioned him quite prominently in dealing with this.
Now, John Brown had a raid, the raid at Harper's Ferry, and he was basically a lot like Nat Turner, but there were 2 different times, different places. Now, his raid was the same thing as Nat Turner. Yeah, he was like, well, we're going to attack on Harper's Ferry, kill these slave owners, but there's a catch. John Brown was Caucasian. He was an abolitionist. Nat Turner was a freedman. He was a freed slave. And now, back then, they had no idea what John Brown was going on, because they thought, he's white, he doesn't stand up for slavery, he owned slaves, but it wasn't like that. He was an abolitionist.
And so John Brown's attacked upon Harper. But now, one of the things that happened to John Brown was hanged, was he not?
And so was Nat Turner.
Both were hanged. Tell me something about the hanging of John Brown.
Now, I mentioned this in segment 1. Future Confederate General Stonewall Jackson and John Wilkes Booth, the man who assassinated Abraham Lincoln, President Abraham Lincoln, were both present at his execution. And many people don't know this, but John Wilkes Booth stole a Confederate uniform to gain admission to John Brown's execution. Now, I'm not exactly sure why he wanted to be there so badly that he had to steal a Confederate outfit. But basically, when you think about it, you can think about he wanted to see him die. He wanted to see somebody who cared about slavery die, perish.
And so with these two insurrections, the John Brown slave insurrection and the Emmett Till, and I think one of the final incidents of violence in the South has to do with the celebration of Dr. King's birthday. What about the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, and how would you fit all of that into this violence that you've talked about?
Well, the assassination of Martin Luther King, he was shot and killed at the Lorraine Hotel while standing on his balcony, and right below him was Jesse Jackson, who was the first to notice that Martin Luther King perished. And he was murdered because he stood up for African American rights. He fought back against Jim Crow laws, Jim Crow.
Segregation.
And people didn't like that. So they decided to shoot him so it would all basically stop. Well, it hasn't. Then came the NAACP and they became stronger. And then they took over that place. And, the NAACP represents Dr. King and his peaceful way of getting things over with, having rights for African Americans. Now the Black Panthers, they fought with violence. And another thing that I think many people may know is that Tupac Shakur and his mother and grandmother were all a part of the Black Panther Society. And they fought for rights with anger. They did not fight in peaceful ways. The NAACP and Martin Luther King did. Now, the Black Panther Society represents Martin Luther King, and that's how that went along.
And so you've got all of this violence, and in the end, over the last minute that we have here, what would you say to young people in terms of all the things that you've said today about violence? How would you?
I would say stop gun violence. I mean, who is it helping? You killing somebody else isn't helping anybody. You're just creating more violence for the world.
And what would you say about the need for guns? Do you think that there's a real need for guns anywhere now?
Well, I'm not sure. Guns hurt people. Well, actually, I don't think there is a need for guns, really. I mean, now people say there is a need for guns, but what about protection? Now, you'd have to live in a perfect world to have no guns, no anything, no crime, but there's always going to be guns around, and no matter how much people try to stop it, it's up to today's generation to stop it.
And so you think that there's a real need on the part of people today to sort of come together and move against violence and in a real sense, as Dr. Martin Luther King said, to love one another. You think that there's a need for that today, and you stand as an advocate for that kind of understanding. Is that what you're telling me as we enter the last 30 seconds of this show? Let's say
I do.
You believe that and that people should be warm and wonderful toward one another and move away from violence, gun violence.
Hug each other, hug your neighbor, love your neighbor. Love everybody. What's the problem with that?
Okay, very good. Of course, Lana, let me thank you again for bringing by that unusual kind of information today. And also let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.